Hello and good evening. Welcome to tonight's webinar on psychological. My name is Carla Evans and I'm an associate professor at the Department of Psychology at University of York. And tonight I'll be hosting the webinar and our guest speaker, Dean Burnett. A few technical notes before introducing our speaker. If you are watching live, you can ask questions using the Q&A button on your screen. This is available throughout the event, so questions can be asked at any time. Should you have technical issues, such as loss of Wi-Fi, you can rejoin the event using your original link. Please also remember that today's event is being recorded, so you will be able to watch again. Subtitles are available in this event. To turn these on or off, use the CC Live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. Now to introduce our tonight's speaker, Dean Burnett. Dean Burnett is a neuroscientist, a blogger, and sometimes a comedian and author. Previously employed as a psychiatry tutor and lecturer at the Cardiff University Centre for Medical Education, he is currently an honorary research associate at the Cardiff Psychology School, as well as a visiting industry fellow at Birmingham City University. A full-time author, he was previously known for his satirical science column, Brain Flapping, at The Guardian, which ran from 2012 to 2018. He is the author of the internationally acclaimed best-selling book, The Idiot Brain, and today he will be telling us about his latest book, Psychological. Without further ado, please let me welcome Dean Burnett.
Hello, thank you, Carla. Thank you. Very nice for the introduction. Hello, everyone at York and beyond, obviously. It's an online event. You could be anywhere. So this is my event about my book, Psychological. If I seem a little bit frazzled, I just recently, before the event started, got back from taking my 9-year-old son to watch the Wales-Turkey football game. I have no interest in football, but he does. So I obviously try to be a supportive father. It does mean I spent the best part of 2 hours getting very stressed about something I don't understand. And as a good prelude to talk about mental health is probably hard to think up. So I'm going to bring up my slides now. Okay, so this is a talk about or based around my book, Psychological. 2 words, very clever, I thought. People haven't so much agreed yet, they haven't even commented. It's all about mental health and why it goes wrong in the scientific sense, what's happening in the brain when we experience things like depression, anxiety, psychosis, addiction, and things like that, because it all comes from the brain in some capacity, as does everything else we experience in any part of our lives. It's a good thing about the brain. It's responsible for everything. And so I thought I'd, been long in the works, but I did a book about why these things are happening, because I think it's important and often overlooked to acknowledge and understand that when mental health does go wrong, it's not something mysterious. It's not some sort of quirk in the universe. It's not just pure bad luck, or sometimes it can be, of course. There is a rational scientific basis for it. Just because we can't necessarily see it or understand it doesn't mean it's not there. And with all the talk about mental health awareness, which is of course very good, and I support all that, I do think there is often an omission of understanding, because being aware of something doesn't necessarily mean you do anything about it. It doesn't mean it changes. It just means you acknowledge it as a thing that exists. And no, that's only the start of the journey, not the end. So I think there's more scope to be had for discussing mental health problems, how they work scientifically, giving them a more tangible basis in the real world. So if there is a thrust to this book and my talks about it, it's that. It's like trying to bring forward the underlying science of mental health and how it goes wrong, rather than just spreading the word that it does happen, which it does, but that's not the end of the story. So before I begin properly, a few quick disclaimers. It's a very big field, mental health, and how it goes wrong, and lots of people involved with it. I'm a neuroscientist, and I think that's relevant because all things come down to the brain, and a lot of what happens with mental health can be traced back to, as far as the current evidence suggests, things happen in the brain which perhaps shouldn't be happening, or should be happening, but are up at the wrong times, in the wrong way, in the wrong sense, and so on and so on. So I'm not a trained psychiatrist. I have trained psychiatrists, but it's not the same thing, say those who can't, but I object to that that cliche on principle, because it sounds like those who teach people are incompetent, which is not the case. I'm not a medic myself, but again, I've taught those. So I like to think to myself, as this next point true, as a jack of all trades. I've sort of dabbled in every part of the field when it comes to understanding and dealing with mental health problems. And I think that's potentially a more useful one, because the understanding and approach towards mental health is becoming more holistic, is trying to take into account more and more things. It's not just about the underlying biology now, or the one thing that happened to you that time that caused this to occur. It's all of it. It's all of the aspects of your life and things that occur in it and to you and things you think. They all feed into mental health in some way, shape, or form. So I think having a broad spectrum of insight is perhaps a more useful approach than some will use. Your mileage may vary on that. I'm not from a classic academic background either. I mean, some people who are lecturers and things like that, they are from families which do that, from very well-educated types and things like that. And I'm not from that. I'm sort of from a working class mining valley in South Wales. I grew up in a pub. So I'm not your classic academic stock in that respect. But I do think that can be helpful. It perhaps, if not so much insight, gives a certain sense of empathy or understanding of how life works in communities outside the concrete towers of academia. And also a lot of mental health problems are associated with poor living conditions and poverty and social stigma and things like that. And I think if you have a privileged background, you're less likely to be aware of such things just because they haven't happened to you personally. I've seen it myself, so I like to think I can approach things from a more socially informed perspective. Again, some people might dispute that. That's entirely your right. Speaking of mental health and any problem with it, it's always an intensely subjective thing. I'm going to describe some disorders tonight and say these are the qualities of them. You may have an official diagnosis of these qualities and not have any recognition of what I'm talking about, because any efforts to pin down mental health problems to a rigid set of descriptions and qualities is always kind of doomed to fail, because it's all about the human mind, which is incredibly subjective. The only person who knows exactly how your mental health problem works is you. If you have a mental health problem yourself, you are technically more of an expert than I am in your particular manifestation of it. So I'm not trying to lecture anyone or tell them that they do anything wrong. Just I'm trying to say, according to the current scientific evidence, this is what we think is happening. You may think, well, that doesn't happen to me. Entirely valid. That's just how it works. Unfortunately, it makes it more confusing or more interesting. Depends on what you like. And just to be completely clear, in this talk, I'm talking about the science and the methods when it comes to recognizing, understanding, and dealing with, insofar as we can, mental health problems. Not the problems with the mental health care system as it stands, because there are many. I'm no doubt about that. I can assure you, like I've spoken to many people who have experience of long waiting times, mistreatment at the hands of people who are charged with their care, just like disrespectful attitudes, dismissal, doubt, and things like that. These are all valid problems which absolutely do need to be addressed, but those aren't the things I'm looking at here. Those are problems of the application rather than the science itself. The example I use is like saying, in Britain, the train systems are known to be ridiculous. They are badly run, badly organized, badly funded, overpriced. But those don't suggest there's a problem with the engineering systems of locomotion. It's how these things are put into practice. And that's a sort of different issue to be dealing with. But it's still very important. I'm just not going to dwell on that here. Okay, so start the very basics. What is mental health? When we say that term, what do we mean? The World Health Organization, currently very well known because of the pandemic, obviously, they describe it as a state of well-being in which the individual realizes his or her own abilities, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. That makes sense, but I think that's perhaps missing the mark a bit personally. I think that describes as more mentally healthy rather than mental health. It describes what you're like, what you can do if you have good mental health. Doesn't necessarily say what mental health really is. Again, it's a very broad term. People can define it how they like. I think everyone has a vague understanding of it, but a specific definition is kind of elusive. I like to think of it as analogous to physical health, it says here. When it comes to physical health, you have your tissues, organs, bones, or the various systems like digestive and respiratory, all working together effectively to result in maintaining your body in a way which it is indicative of good physical health. All the disparate parts of your body are working in concert to support you as an existing being, and they're all working, within certain parameters which don't cause any problems. So that's like physical health, when all the parts of your body are working as they should. I would say similarly, our brain produces things like emotions, thoughts, moods, perceptions, attitudes, beliefs, motivations, and so on and so on and so on. Memories, even put those in there, instincts, all the different things our brain is constantly producing, which make us us. So all these things are working together, effectively giving rise to a mind with good mental health. None of these particular facets of the brain are cause any problems right now. So we are in good mental health because all the things our brain is doing to create our mind are chugging along, maybe not fine, maybe not well, but without incident. So that's how I think of mental health. Like I say, call it the Musketeers approach, all for one and one for all. Because you don't need everything to go wrong to have poor physical health or poor mental health. You've got a kidney stone, it's a small part of a small organ, but it completely wipes you out and knocks you flat because it's really painful and sort of disruptive. So long as one part of the system is going wrong, then you can be in poor health. Similarly, if you have bad mood or like low mood disorder or constant fear, that's only one part of your mind or brain going wrong, but you're still said to have poor mental health. So it's not like, everything's got to go wrong to count as that. It's more of a gestalt. It's a group effort. So that's mental health. What is mental illness? As I alluded to, it's when things go wrong. That's why most people listen to this talk, I suppose, why most people read my books and things, because they don't want to know what mental health is. They want to know why it goes wrong and what to do about it. So mental illness is actually not a term as commonly used as it once was, because it has various connotations. It's like a negative thing. Illness is bad, and judgmental aspects can arise from that. But then again, what is illness? It's a less certain and specific term than many would assume, as I found when I tried to look into it. If you look up illness in the dictionary, at least the one I used, it said illness, the experience of being sick, which, okay, that makes sense. So look up, the experience of sickness. So look up sickness, it says a period of being ill. So, it's very circular. Neither of those explain the other. Professor Marinka, an experienced GP from a few decades ago, tried to contextualize it as the modes of unhealth. He defined the three following terms. Disease is the actual pathology, the root cause of the health problem, the tumor, the break, the injury, the pathogen, the thing that is causing your health to go wrong, the actual physical, tangible thing, that's the disease. The illness is a subjective experience of poor health. You feel ill. You have a disease, but you feel ill. Subjectively, you do not feel good, ergo, you are ill. Sickness is the social public expression of poor health. You have a disease, you feel ill, but other people say, oh, you are sick. So you meet some sort of social criteria for, okay, your health is declined enough so we can say that you are sick. That's why you get a sick note from your doctor, because someone else has to validate your sickness. So it was kind of straightforward, can be quite helpful when you talk in medical terms where precision is important. But even here, lots of confusion and variability are possible. Like even with physical health issues, which are quite common. So if you are diabetic, you have a disease, you're not responsive to insulin or you can't produce it, that's the mechanism. You are technically ill, you can feel ill if you have low blood sugar, but are you sick? Are you incapable of functioning? If it's not maintained, sure, but if you take regular insulin and monitor your blood sugar, you can live a perfectly normal, functional life. So people would struggle to say a diabetic is objectively sick. HIV and AIDS, like 40, 50 years ago, absolutely terrible thing to have. Someone with HIV was definitely sick and they were very, very ill. But now, because of retroviral therapies and like the maintenance of it, it can be easily managed. And so people can live, again, very productive, normal lives with HIV positive diagnosis. Are they sick? Some people would still say yes, because they have HIV. But objectively, you should say no, because they are not compromised in any way. They don't feel ill. They just have this disease, which is there, but not doing anything bad. So, you can see why it causes problems and issues and confusion, even in the straightforward physical health realm. So how does it affect when it comes to mental illness? That's something which comes up a lot. People make this claim quite often, and it's worth probing. Are mental health problems the same as physical ones? Should we equate the two as interchangeable in terms of how we work, how they work, how we approach them, how we think of them? They're often compared or equated. A little sort of post on the side there, which is one of those ones that's regularly going around Facebook to encapsulate the whole argument that what would it be like if you treated physical health problems like people treat mental health ones? Like someone's in bed saying, well, have you tried having a different attitude? Someone's like vomiting, have you tried not having the flu? Someone's been stabbed. You're not really trying, you're lazy. These aren't things you would say to someone with a serious physical health problem. Mental health problems can be just as severe, just as debilitating, but we say to people with those things. So it can be helpful to sort of try and equate the two and show that, well, it's wrong because you shouldn't do that with this type of illness if you don't do it with this one. It's a valid comparison in many ways because there is genuinely a lot of overlap between them. There's a lot of uncertainty with both physical and mental health ones, even if we think of physical health problems as having a cold or a broken bone. Those are fairly straightforward, but there's still plenty of uncertainty. You can go through like several different diagnoses before they find what's wrong with you in a physical sense. So you have these symptoms, what's causing them? Hard to say. We don't really know until someone sort of finds the right diagnosis. Same thing happens with mental health a lot. You speak to a lot of people and they have to give over a lot of information before people do realize what's actually happening. And you can have chronic or discrete episodes. You can have permanent, ongoing physical health problems and mental health ones. You can have short, sharp bursts of physical health problems. You can short, intense episodes of mental health problems. They can vary in terms of severity. They can be quite, not helpful, but sort of mild, or they can be completely debilitating, and so on and so on. That applies to both physical and mental health problems. My contention is that equating mental health and physical health problems is good if you're trying to convince someone that mental health problems are to be taken seriously. Because most people, perhaps who need to be made aware of mental health problems, won't have any direct experience of them that they recognize. But pretty much all of them will have some sort of experience with physical health problems. It's incredibly rare to go your whole life and reach adulthood without any sort of bump or injury or headache or stomach upset. Or we all have at least a tangible recognition of what happens when physical health declines. We know what it feels like. So it gives us something to relate to. So like, this mental health problem is like a physical health problem. When you had food poisoning that time, imagine if it was your brain vomiting out anxiety. I mean, that's a bad comparison, but it's sort of, it makes things more relatable and understandable. So I do think it's a good tactic to use when you're trying to convince someone who perhaps refuses to accept it or just has no awareness of it. To compare physical to mental health problems can be useful, but it can be unhelpful too, because they are different in a lot of significant ways. Example I use, a dog and a frog have a lot of similarities. Both got 4 legs, both have sort of a similar face structure, eyes, mouth, both found in the UK a lot, both feature a lot of children's books. The names are very similar too, both end in OG. So, dogs and frogs have a lot in common. But if you were to buy yourself a pet frog and take it home, put it in a nice warm basket and give it dog food, you'd have a dead frog pretty soon, because as similar as they are, dogs and frogs have a lot of very significant differences too. And that is, when you say mental health problems are just like physical ones, you overlook that, you ignore that, and that can be misleading in a lot of unhelpful ways. So they're not the same as physical ones for various reasons. Physical ailments, they tend to be a focus on repair or cure, fixing the problem. And people say like, are you better yet? You broke your leg. Are you better yet? Oh, you had the flu. Are you better yet? Valid question, because we know these things are temporary. We know our body hopefully regenerates and sort of fights them off eventually and goes back to normal. The idea of going back to normal is very common with physical health problems. Even if they're quite severe, like we need surgery or chemotherapy, the goal is to fix or remove the problem and bring someone back to the original state of good health. Mental health doesn't normally work that way. It's more of an enduring problem. Mental health issues, typically they're treated by methods which involve adjusting, managing, and coping. It makes some more uncertainty, but obviously if you keep saying to people mental health problems like physical health ones, and they encounter someone who's having a mental health problem, then they will expect them to get better, perhaps. They will think, well, you'll be fine soon, you've got some medicine, you've got some tablets, well, I'll see you back at work on Monday. Again, it's not how it works. It sets up false expectations. Even if you're someone who has been told that mental health problems like physical ones, then you develop on yourself a mental health problem. Maybe you'd be led to expect a cure, a fix, when there is none available. And that can be stressful, disappointing, upsetting, angering, all things which tend to make mental health problems worse. Also, the treatment and patient practitioner relationship also needs to be different in mental health a lot of the time, but it's often not. The disease model or the medical model of mental health is something which comes under a lot of criticism these days. It's where, in a nutshell, it's where GPs and practitioners like psychiatrists treat mental health problems like they would physical health ones. So someone comes in and says, I've got depression. So right, you take this course of medication, do what I say, I'll see you in a month, we'll see if you're better. And a lot of medics, that's how they train, to treat disorders and physical problems like that. But those don't often work in mental health issues. And a lot of the time because, well, the patient is the only source of real information. Like, the patient should be more involved in the process because it's all happening within their mind. They can't be passive in this. You can't say, take these tablets, go away and don't do anything without my say so. Not possible. So a lot of the better methods involve sort of a two-way relationship, a lot of interchange, and but given restrictions in resources and different types of training and applications, the medical model tends to be used a lot for mental health problems, and it can be unhelpful. It can be sort of like a hit and miss, or perhaps sometimes counterproductive, because you're treating a mental health problem like a physical one. You shouldn't do that. And things like capacity, the ability to understand what's happening to you and what's going on, your identity, your self-awareness, these can all be more profoundly affected by a mental health problem because it's happening within the confines of your mind. If you've got a broken leg, you're not happy about it, it's broken, you're upset, you're in pain, but you're still you. You're the you with a broken leg. But that's not necessarily how it works with mental health problems, because when you're in hospital, the physical thing, people come and see you, you have visiting hours and you talk to them like you would normally. And when you need help, you can be thankful and grateful and stuff. But when you have a mental health problem, usually you need support and help more. But because you can't fulfill the social contract, if someone says, I'll help you, say thank you, I'll help you back, and people think you're different. They think, they don't see what's going on in your head. So your friends react differently perhaps, and your social relationships become strained at the worst possible time. So these are all consequences of treating mental health like physical health. And it's not necessarily the best approach. More nuance is required, and often it doesn't happen. So it's fun and easy to sort of make these comparisons, but they don't always help. So a better understanding would be more beneficial, in my opinion. Speaking of, at what point is someone officially mentally unwell? So when does someone go from being mentally well to mentally unwell? It's hard to say, because we know how the body looks. We know when a leg looks broken, and we know when someone's leaking black fluid from their orifices, that's not meant to happen. Can't really do that with the mind, because someone being sad because they just got some bad news and someone being in grips of depression looks exactly the same from the outside. And the mind doesn't have any tangible limits or objectifiable restrictions and characteristics. So we have to do a more loose and nebulous analysis. There's lots of ways to use criteria to say who's mentally well and who's mentally unwell. Is the individual statistically abnormal? Can you measure the thing that they're expressing, and does it deviate significantly from the rest of the population? You do this with IQ. Everyone has a high IQ score, and the average of the population is 100. But if you're too significant the standard deviations above or below, you have an abnormal IQ. Could be higher, could be lower than the average, but it's abnormal. So you can, but it's hard to do this with most mental health characteristics. Like, what if someone has an abnormal depressive index? There's no such thing as a sort of, you can't measure depression like that. Someone's in a bad mood, someone isn't in a bad mood. It's hard to pin down these things to make mathematical comparisons. So you can also say, is the individual with the problem, are they experiencing stress, discomfort, or pain? It suggests that something has gone wrong internally with their mind, and therefore there's a problem to be fixed. Obviously a very helpful approach, but not inclusive of everything. Someone with mania, usually they're quite, it's quite a euphoric experience. They are quite energized, they're quite motivated, they think they're on top of the world, and they make terrible decisions as a result and sort of end up scuppering their chances later in life, but they would say they're fine. Or like things which, like hallucinations or delusions, people don't know, they don't have the capacity to recognize that something is going wrong with them. They don't feel in pain. It's the outside, which people are saying, okay, something's not right here. So it's impairs a judgment. Are the people behaving and thinking in ways which are maladaptive, unhelpful, objectively harmful to themselves or society? Are they doing things which cause themselves damage, or are they being actively damaging to the people around them, or both? So if someone ticks all these boxes, then you can say it's an official mental illness or a mental disorder, which makes sense, right? Technically, yes, but consider the following. Homosexuality was once a mental disorder. It's not now, never should have been. but for a long time it officially was. Until the 1970s, homosexuality was an official mental disorder. Now, 50 years later, legal same-sex marriage is increasingly common in the developed world and beyond. That's quite a shift, from something being an actual illness to being just part of everyday life is quite a drastic movement. So what happened? Well, technically, homosexuality did meet the criteria for mental disorders. Statistically, fewer people are gay than they are straight. So like they are statistically abnormal in that sense, like 1 in 10, that's 10% of the population. Most people aren't gay, so it must be an aberration, as the logic said at the time. It was maladaptive because people who were gay were very stressed, and the coming out experience was really stressful and caused them a lot of pain. And it was socially maladaptive because sex is for reproduction, and if you don't do that, society becomes compromised, and therefore it met all the criteria for a mental health disorder. Except, homosexuality never changed between now and then. We did, society did. Our benchmarks for what normal changed with it. We know now, we recognize that sex isn't purely for reproduction because we're not animals, we're not bacteria, that's not how it works. The stress of coming out and being gay was caused by society, by stigma, by condemnation, by judgment and things like that. And of course, we've done a lot more research into the psychology behind it all. It's perfectly natural. So, this homosexuality was once and now is not a mental disorder, but that suggests there's a lot of implications for diagnosis today. What diagnosis are we seeing now which wouldn't necessarily meet the criteria in 50 years' time? How are we going to change in ways to recognize things now as saying that's a disorder, and 20 years' time we go, oh, no, it's not, sorry about that. It's really hard to say. We're more refined than we are now, where we were then. We have a lot more scope, a lot more information, but still, the possibility is there, which is why some people object to psychiatry in general, the concept of diagnosis. I think that's an extreme reaction, but there's a certain logic to it. Just to clarify, when you say it was officially registered as a mental health disorder, it was normally in one of these two things: the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the ICD, the International Classification of Diseases. One's by the American Psychiatric Association, the DSM, and the WHO, the World Health Organization, makes the ICD. They're both just where all the mental health disorders are listed, and they're constantly updated as new information comes in, and diseases that are shifted around from different categories, and some are just got rid of altogether, like homosexuality. And they have, both their pros and cons, their strengths and weaknesses. I won't dwell on that too much because it's kind of a distraction, but for anyone to review these slides later on, you can. There it is. And finally, in this part, psychiatry and psychology, they are not the same thing. And I know this because I once ran a psychiatry program where we had a lot of people messaging to say, I want to be a psychiatrist. So I've done my psychology degree, and I had to tell them they couldn't because that's not the same thing. A psychiatrist is a qualified medical doctor who was specialized, after they've done all their training, in psychiatry, the treatment of mental health problems. Psychologist is a scientist who specializes in the study of the mind and how it works and things like that. Different horses for different courses. Both can work in a clinical setting, but they offer different things. Like psychiatrists can prescribe medication and diagnose things. Psychologists, clinical psychologists, can help with the diagnosis, and they can do the more long-term therapy and management and talking treatments and things like that. So a clinical psychologist described it to me as the difference being like chefs. But rather than having a recipe and looking for the ingredients, which is what psychiatrists do, she argued, psychologists are presented with the ingredients and have to make something from what they've got. So it's all like, taking different approaches to the same patient. As I see it, psychiatry is what happens when you have healthcare as it exists and insert the mind into it. So healthcare has to be applied to the mind. And psychology happens when you have study of the mind and realize that it's gone wrong and try to work out how to fix it. So introduce healthcare into the study of the mind. They don't always get on, the psychiatrists, psychologists. There's lots of turf wars and stuff, and disputes and things like that. But by and large, they do. It's a multidisciplinary approach is always the most beneficial, according to any data you look at. So to get onto the specifics, let's look at some actual disorders. Depression, of course, what I would describe as the poster child of mental health problems. You say mental health or mental illness to anyone, odds are they'll immediately think of depression because it perhaps gets mentioned the most. Oh my God, oh, it's fine. It is the most common type of mental health problem in the world today. Between 3 and 10% of people are afflicted with depression. That's quite a wide variation, like 3% of the population and 10%. That's a massive, massive error bar there. A lot to do with the fact it's kind of hard to pin down a diagnosis of depression sometimes, because if someone has a depressive disorder, they're right, they've got depression. And later on they have a manic episode. Oh no, wait, that was bipolar disorder the whole time. And the different types of depression and things like that. So it's kind of hard to pin down. So there's a lot of variation, and criteria varies too. Some people might be quite loose with their criteria. Some people might be quite strict. Depression has to be these things. Classed as a mood disorder, of course, but that can lead to misunderstanding, stigma. They say it makes people think you're in a bad mood. So they say snap out of it, etc., which is literally a pointless thing to say to someone with depression. It's almost actively harmful. Not only saying you have a mood disorder, but it's your fault and you're just enjoying it. So stop it. In truth, depression, although very often associated with low mood, can be expressed as flat affect, when like literally having no mood, no emotional reactions, or even aggression sometimes as forms of depression which have an aggressive manifestation. It can be like different levels of severity and things, but first and foremost, it's more readily defined by the duration and persistence of a low mood. So if you have like a low mood, that happens a lot to a lot of people, especially during a pandemic. But if your mood doesn't change for 2 weeks or more, then it's thought of as being disorder, because it's very weird for someone's mood to be fixed in place for a fortnight. That's not how moods normally work. If that does happen, then we suspect something is wrong. And no, most people will say that depression is the result of a chemical imbalance in the brain. So it's all your brain chemicals out of whack. This is actually quite an outdated view now. It's part of the bigger picture, but that's not the whole story by any means anymore. A more modern theory, modern model for depression, it involves neuroplasticity. It's one of the more prominent theories why depression happens. Neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to change. The individual nerve cells can make new connections, lose old ones, change their shape and form in response to what is happening to them in the brain. It's the source of the brain's power, really. It changes and adapts to what happens to it. That's how we learn things. It's how we experience things. It's how we modify our behavior. It's how we grow, and so on and so on. So it's very important. Chemical imbalance is an aspect of that, but it seems to be more a symptom than a cause. At the moment, we think the core problem is that the neurons responsible for changing mood and responding to things, they become inflexible. They sort of become exhausted. They lose neuroplasticity. Therefore, your mood gets stuck in place. Explains the duration of low moods, because if you have the neurons that control mood can't move, they're on standby essentially, then your mood would be stuck in place. And why SSRIs, which raise serotonin, are the go-to, because serotonin is the neurotransmitter which it sort of amplifies the brain's ability to change mood, experience different emotions. So obviously that would help in a condition where not being able to change your mood is the problem. And that makes sense. But then, of course, we have antidepressants, which is probably where the chemical imbalance theory comes from. Antidepressants raise the levels of certain neurotransmitters, and that leads to an alleviation in the symptoms of depression. Well, that's what we hope. That's what normally happens, but not the same for everyone, and not everyone has the same benefits. Often unfairly stigmatized as a result, I feel, for various reasons. There's all the conspiracy around big pharma and stuff, but antidepressants have a lot of issues which people don't realize going in, or like when they've quite casually been discussed. It is, they do work by increasing the levels of neurotransmitter that are reduced in a depressed brain, hence the chemical imbalance idea. Chemicals are imbalanced, antidepressants put them back in balance, essentially. But they take several weeks to have therapeutic effects despite acting right away. On the chemical level, antidepressants fix the imbalance pretty much immediately. But it takes 2 weeks for us to feel any benefit normally, and perhaps more than that. Although we have the side effects right away, which is unfortunate, because that's what will happen if you have a chemical which messes around with the levels of chemicals in your brain throughout your brain, because drugs aren't targeted, they affect the whole brain if they've got that sort of action, then you'll have a lot of side effects. And we're never sure how they're going to work, might not at all, or might even make things worse, because the brain is different. Everyone's brain is different. It's shaped by environmental factors, the things you experience, your life events, your diet, your genes, and so on and so on. So drugs which affect the brain have kind of a different effect for pretty much everyone. A lot will be beneficial, maybe a lot won't though. So there's no guarantee with these things. Same applies to medication for most physical things, really, but they tend to have more of a track record. So why are antidepressants like this? Well, the neuroplasticity mechanism can help explain this. Most go-to antidepressants work on neurotransmitters that are part of the monoamine class associated in neurons. So like serotonin, dopamine, and noradrenaline, these are all monoamine neurotransmitters. They're very important, but they're a small part of the brain. Like they They spread throughout it, but they don't take up much space in the brain. They don't do a lot of things. They just do a lot of very important things. So it's like the veins in marble. They're there, they're everywhere, but they're not the bulk. And gradual increase of neurotransmitters via the monoamine system could mean that we're slowly coaxing the exhausted mood neurons back into life because they have limited application. So it's like blowing on a sort of dying campfire, like slowly coax it back. There are now newer antidepressants, things like ketamine and psychotropics, and they seem more potent and effective. And a lot of that's to do with the fact that, like ketamine, for example, they've just released a new transmitter a couple of years ago, which they're trialing. It's a nasal spray, and it seems to have antidepressant effects by the next day, if not within a few hours, which is much better than our current models. And one possibility is that because they are having a better effect on neuroplasticity, because ketamine uses glutamate, the most widespread and common and powerful excitatory transmitter. It causes the most stuff to happen in the brain. So if you take ketamine, rather than just blowing on the campfire, it's like just throwing petrol on it and throwing lit matches. It's like, go on, go, go, go. And sort of things come back to life a lot faster. And so neuroplasticity and the loss of is reversed quicker. And that's sort of why this model is sort of becoming more dominant than things like chemical imbalances. So that's what we think has happened in the brain when depression occurs. Anxiety, another one, second most common mental health problem. There are lots of variations: general anxiety disorder, PTSD, agoraphobia, panic disorder, general phobias. These are all types of anxiety disorder. A general criteria can be trickier. Major depressive disorder, you need symptoms for 2 weeks. For generalized anxiety disorder, consistent symptoms for 6 months, which is a bit much, a bit of a leap. But that's because there's lots more in modern life which cause us to be anxious. Threat of losing your job, poor economy, what if you can't pay your bills, what if your partner is having problems, what if your health declines. It's normal to be anxious about things in everyday life. But when you're anxious for 6 months solid for no discernible reason, that's when you get a diagnosis. And general rule of thumb is that the fear, anxiousness, and stress has to be irrational, like I say, disproportional, or genuinely interfere with your ability to function. That's why normal anxiety becomes clinical, diagnosed anxiety. And neurologically, there appears to be a problem with the threat detection system, the brain's ability to monitor your senses and find threats, centered on the amygdala, a powerful emotional processing region, fast, influential, but kept in check by the cognitive, the higher parts of your brain, which do the thinking. These sort of like sort of constant to and fro of like, who's in charge today? I'm in charge. Like, we have a stressful thing, I'm the amygdala, I'll handle this. Like, today, calmly, I'm the higher brain, I'm in charge of this, we don't need you today, and so on and so on. With anxiety, this balance is disrupted. The amygdala becomes too powerful, influences too much thought and behavior, so we're constantly afraid when we don't need to be. And our ability to control it is reduced by various flaws in the neurological system. And it manifests in various ways. And explains why anxiolytics, like the anti-anxiety drugs like this, can be so addictive because they suppress the fear and stress system. And our brain likes that. It goes, oh, no stress. That is really nice. Don't get that very often. More of this, please. And that's why you have to be very careful when administering these things. The common element of both of these, the more common mental health problems, seems to be stress. Stress is the precursor of the fight or flight response. So when you have when you're afraid of something, you have a fear reaction, your body tends to go into fight or flight, but it's not an all or nothing thing. It doesn't mean that everything you even vaguely potentially scares you kicks off this full fight or flight reaction. Stress is like the build-up. Okay, so getting ready. Are we going to have a fight or flight? Are we going to? Maybe getting ready. It's like the amber light on the traffic light. Or if fight or flight is like the big boss in a video game, stress is like all the minions they send towards you before you get to them. And those can still be very damaging. They can still, you might not win against those. And stress is, a common part of life, but sort of like an evolutionary quirk, human brain doesn't handle prolonged chronic stress very well. The chemical impact builds up and takes its toll. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis usually regulates the levels of stress chemicals like cortisol in the body, but after prolonged stress, it sort of it gets worn out. It stops responding. It's like a blocked overflow in a bath. Like normally it was drain the water out, but now it can't. So things spill over the side and damage occurs. And this is unhelpful because the human brain is very easily stressed by intangible things we're imagining, things we're predicting that may not happen or even cannot happen. We are stressed by things that happened in the past. You ran across the road, a car nearly hit you. That'll stress you out for the day. It didn't happen. It can't happen now. It's in the past, but you're still stressed about it. So, that's the brain is very good at finding sources of stress. And this may be a key factor in a lot of common mental health problems. Too much stress can overwork the amygdala, make it more dominant, make it more strong, like a muscle has been exercised. Similarly, stress chemicals can exhaust the neurons, perhaps, that control mood, reducing plasticity, and you get depression, which explain why there's so much comorbidity. People have both depression and anxiety in much like 30% of cases, like a third of all people with depression will have anxiety, or vice versa. And explains why antidepressants, which work for anxiety too, they are the go-to default medication because anxiolytics are a bit too potent, a bit too strong. And experiencing stress is a subjective measure, and how vulnerable you are to it and how you react to it varies widely from person to person. If you've had a particularly hard life, your brain is pretty much maxed out when it comes to absorbing stress. Whereas if you had quite an easy life, or you're quite sturdy in terms of the things you've dealt with, you can absorb a lot more, a bigger cushion to deal with. And so mental disorders are still so complex and unpredictable. That's why people in impoverished high crime areas are more prone to them, because they have higher stress levels because they have to deal with that. So it takes less stress to tip their brain over the edge into a mental health episode. So in summary, our understanding of mental health problems are constantly evolving thanks to ongoing scientific research and assessment. However, they're often intangible problems defined by social and cultural benchmarks, which are forever in flux. We're always changing as the world around us moves on. Makes them understanding them and defining and treating them kind of complicated. Hence, we don't have a rough understanding or a complete understanding yet, maybe never will. And that's why even considering all the different therapeutic methods and approaches that are in use, psychiatry, psychology, alternative remedies, which can work, eye movement desensitization, and so on and so on. On top of that, mental health problems stem from the brain, which is itself vastly complex, variable, and unpredictable. So a lot of hurdles in between us and a full understanding of mental health. A lot of common ideas and theories about mental health are becoming outdated as our knowledge of the brain expands. The scientific basis and practice is regularly revised to reflect this. And despite this, some common roots like stress and the more typical disorders are being identified. So that's a general rundown of the what I say in the book. Thank you for listening to this talk. And I think there are maybe some questions now for the Q&A.
Okay, we're back. Dean, thank you very much for this really, really interesting explanation and kind of through the book. So I had kind of following up on what you've been just saying, I have a question and I'll field some more other questions from our listeners. So I really like your introduction on looking at mental health and drawing the similarities and differences, and maybe saying that the attitude towards mental health should be like we think about physical health, right? Mm-hmm. And so I know this is not a self-help book. However, I was wondering, based on neuroscience, you've kind of individuated one way that we could possibly do things that are good for our mental health, right? Often you'll hear doctors say, exercise, eat well, sleep, and this will help your physical health. So are you saying, well, I guess it's kind of easy to say that's reduce stress or mental stress, primarily not physical stress, to help reduce the possibility of depression or anxiety. But there's other mental health issues. Can you give some idea based on neuroscience what might be a good keeping of our mental health? Is there ways you can?
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea that you should say to someone you need to reduce your stress levels, it's a very easy instruction, often a very difficult thing to put into practice, because the things that are stressing you out aren't necessarily within your control. It could be that you have live in a high crime area. It could be that you have poor job prospects. You're working 3 jobs just to feed your family and so on. And there are plenty of books from people from more privileged backgrounds who will say you just need to reorganize your life or go traveling and you feel much better. But that's not really an option for most people who have mental health issues. So I think even the statement of reducing your stress is a lot more complex than that simple statement would allow for. I think we've seen a lot in the pandemic too, that there's a lot more to be stressed about, and our options for reducing stress have been severely curtailed. So it's like a double whammy, and we are seeing spikes in mental health symptoms being reported as a result of this. So I think anything which gives you a sense of autonomy, a sense of control of your own life, can help reduce stress. And that can be almost literally anything in terms of what's bothering you, or what do you like. If you can do more of that, then you will feel like, feel better. Or if you just do something, just do anything, like it could be as simple as take up a new hobby, or like, well, I'm be meaning to read through this series of books, I'll start doing that. And I think it's neuroscientifically, the brain does respond to things which make you feel better. So there's no sort of the scale. You don't need to sort of take that into account. It doesn't have to be a major life-changing event. Any change you can enact which makes you feel any sort of pleasure or feel better anyway will be beneficial, will be improving your well-being. And it's also, I think we're so predisposed to comparing ourselves to others. Like I've talked a lot in other places about the problems with toxic positivity, that you have to be happy at all times, otherwise something's wrong. You're doing your life wrong. Like you're a subpar person. That's not how it works at all. Like the brain doesn't or isn't evolved to be default happy at all times. Happiness is a reward state, which means something's going right. If you're happy all the time, that sort of defeats the whole point. So I think these, thanks to things like Instagram, aspirational media, whatever you want to blame it on, there's this idea that we have to be happy at all times, and if we're not, then boo to you, fix that. And that is to be, I would discourage people from following that, because that can be just more detrimental to your well-being. But yeah, I think it's also important to acknowledge that some things will be beyond your control. Like there's so much fascination in the working industry now to say, give people like wellness courses or mindfulness apps, or like in the NHS, say like resilience training. All you got to do is teach yourself to feel better, and you will. And there's more to it than that as well. That's a short-term solution at best. There's going to be plenty of things which are beyond your control and you may need help with, and then that's perfectly fine. That's not something to be ignored. It's not embarrassing. It's just how it works. Okay. So yeah, there's lots of things to say about that, I suppose.
So we have another question that asks, what do you think about the research based around the gut and the connection to your mental health? I mean, is looking after your gut, I guess physical health, really as effective as drugs?
Yeah, they're all sort of kind of part of the same system, really, because at the most fundamental level, your gut is where other chemicals enter your body to replace the ones you've lost. And so the things you put into your body via your stomach, your digestive system, will have a downstream impact on your health and well-being, because just biology, that's just sort of how it works. Also, there are lots of different, obviously, there are trillions of bacteria in your digestive system, which help digest and modify and regulate the chemical system in your body. And the digestive system is incredibly complex in its own right. I mean, I think there's a sort of perhaps assumption that it's just like a wobbly tube full of frilly bits in it, and that's some unpleasant stuff. It's not. It's incredibly complex, incredibly sophisticated. It has its own nervous system called the enteric nervous system, which is so complicated and can be kind of independent. So it's often referred to as the second brain in the body. So it's really, really quite complicated. So indirectly, chemically, what you put in your body via your gut will have a lot of ramifications for your health. But more directly, in terms of mental health, like there's the vagus nerve, the cranial nerve, which sort of links to all your organs. And a lot of what goes on in the body affects the brain's sort of sense of well-being, because all the signals we have from our body give us our sense of self, our sense of identity, our self-awareness. And it's the vagus nerve which is kind of responsible for conveying this information to the brain. And what happens in the gut can cause aberrant activity in the vagus nerve, because there's a direct connection between gut and brain there, and every other organ. And like stimulating the vagus nerve is one of the modern treatments in like persistent depression. If you kickstart the vagus nerve a bit, the brain thinks, okay, maybe I'm not, I'm feeling all right actually, because the body is better than I thought. And you come out with this depressive slump, and so on and so on. So yeah, there are lots of direct, tangible connections between the gut and brain, which can lead to genuine outcomes, positive outcomes for your mental health. But I think, I suppose it's important, even though I say a lot myself, because it's just a handy shorthand, the whole brain and body thing. They're not distinct separate systems. They're like neighbors who share a garden fence. They are heavily intertwined. Like the brain controls a lot what goes on the body, and a lot of what goes on the body directly impacts on the brain. There are theories like we can only experience emotions when we know what's going to happen in our body as a result of them, and so on and so on. So yeah, so there are lots of definite and tangible ways in which what goes on in the gut can affect the brain and vice versa, and same goes for lots of other organs. So, again, it's a complex system.
So a question going back to your first discussion, asking about what are your thoughts on the common model or idea used in mental health care regarding aspects of mental illness being a choice? Now, you've touched upon that a little bit, and could you elaborate a little bit? What is your feel? How can we move from mental health
Yeah.
care looking at this as a choice rather than something that happens?
Yeah, I'm very, very wary of any model which says that mental health consequences, symptoms, or manifestations are a choice. As in, I'm guessing, I mean, I don't think anyone sits down and goes, I think I'll have depression today. That sounds like a laugh, because that's just not how it works. I'm guessing what they mean is that you can choose to experience these symptoms, or you can choose to let them control you, or choose to let them have an impact on you. There's always going to be an element of that, I suppose. But part of I can sort of see the appeal in that it gives agency to the individual patients. And that is a big problem with the medical model, in that patients don't have enough agency. Like, they don't have enough say in their treatment, in their progression, in how they're how they're perceived and dealt with, and so on and so on. So that's bad. Anyone with a mental health problem, which is entirely their own subjective experience, should be strongly involved in how it's dealt with and what's done about it. But you can go too far the other way. You can say, well, this is your mental health problem and it's entirely on you to fix it. And if you're experiencing it, then that's on you as well. I think giving the illusion of control where there isn't any is never going to be helpful. The idea that, so, well, you can, you're in bed with depression, you can choose not to be. I don't think that's true. I don't think that because the depression saps your motivation, it saps your ability to think, it saps your your positivity. It skews your perception. Whereas most people would lean towards the positive interpretation of things said about them, people with depression lean towards the negative. And it suggests, this idea that it's a choice suggests that there's still a part of you which is completely immune to all this. It's a part of your psyche, part of your consciousness, which isn't affected by any of this, which can just overrule it and just choosing not to. And I think that perpetuates stigma more than sort of reduces it. I mean, it's good to be encouraging. It's good to try and be motivational, and a lot of mental health problems will be one step at a time, working through it and sort of putting your way out of it, perhaps. But the idea that you can just choose to be ill or not be ill, I honestly think that can be quite a damaging one and gives entirely the wrong impression of how these things work. So, yeah, I'm not a fan of that. But I can see how it could work with some people. But the idea that it should work for everyone, and people should be told that, I think that will quite easily lead to more problems than any sort of helpful outcomes.
So there was a suggestion to say that if we say that physical disability and mental ill health are treated and approached in the same way that you describe physical ailment is, Helen is suggesting that perhaps as we move forward, the correlation between mental and physical disability would be more helpful than a mental and physical health would be. Should we
Yeah.
look at mental health as a disability rather than health, I guess, illness?
Yeah, I mean, that's that's entirely something to recommend that. I mean, I think because it is such a subjective thing, there are so many schools of thought on the matter. I mean, there are many people who go completely opposite direction and say there's no such thing as a mental health problem. Their argument is, as far as I can make out, I'm not ignoring like the kind of ideological ones which don't conform to any rational basis. The argument is, I see, like every mental health quote unquote problem, as they would not acknowledge it, is actually a valid response to what someone's experienced. Someone's got depression, that's technically a correct response to a stressful and traumatic life. And you can sort of see that point. And I think their contention is there's no mental health disorders. It's that society itself is just too rigid and needs to be more flexible and more accepting and more accommodating for people with different expressions of mentality. And I can sort of see that, and it's a nice sort of it's a judgment-free type of thing. But I don't agree with it myself, because I've met far too many people who are with mental health problems who are genuinely suffering. I don't want this. This is deeply, deeply painful. can you please help? And that attitude leads towards sort of, just look, just leave them be. They're fine. And I don't think that's good. But also this idea that there's no such thing as a mental health problem suggests that there's, the brain itself cannot go wrong. And I know full well that's not true, because you spend 10 minutes in neuroscience, like, oh, this thing's rubbish. It's got a lot of issues going on. But yeah, so I think, classifying it in a certain way will be helpful to some people, and others will strongly object to it. Perhaps we need a new whole idea of way of thinking altogether, and that could be something quite useful. But also, like, I think I should worth stressing that the physical and mental health thing, is not a constant clear divide, and there's a huge amount of overlap in terms of physical health problems can have a lot of mental health symptoms, and a lot of mental health issues can have a lot of physical symptoms. Like, it's not, like I said, it's not brain and versus body. It's they often go hand in hand and feed into each other. So, yeah, I think attaching a specific label to it is it can be helpful in some cases, but I think we need something a bit more complex. Would be my gut feeling on that.
So a more specific question. So what are your thoughts on EMDR, on treating phobias and specific anxiety?
Yeah, eye movement desensitization. It's sort of, it doesn't make a lot of intuitive sense, I think, when you think of it from the layperson's perspective. Like, you move your eyes in different directions and that fixes your brain somehow. It doesn't seem linked. But a lot of modern therapies seem to be based around giving the mental health symptoms something tangible for your brain to work with. Like, so EMDR, so rather than, it involves you consciously controlling something you can consciously control, which gives you a sense of control over the condition. There are other things like biofeedback and neurofeedback, where they strap you to a monitor and monitor your heart rate or brain waves, whatever it is in this case. And if you have an anxiety attack or like a panic attack, they don't say, try and suppress your panic, try and stop being anxious. They say, here's your heart rate on the screen, try and lower that. And it does seem to be more helpful, because when you've got an anxiety issue, you don't know what you're dealing with. You're just experiencing these feelings. They have no tangible aspect. Whereas giving your brain something to work on, something it can feasibly control, it sort of extracts the issue from the deepest part of your mind and gives it an expression. And that gives it gives it parameters, it gives it boundaries, and the brain likes that. It reduces uncertainty. It may not be accurate, it might be like what your heart rate is isn't a panic attack, but it gives your brain something to work on. It gives it it anchors it in reality, and that makes it less scary and unspecific. And that can be, that can sometimes make all the difference. So EMDR and treatments like that, I think they do similar things. They're like, don't worry about what's going on in your brain, which you can't see or tangibly control. Let's focus on this. You can control, and sort of impose that on your underlying condition, and maybe that'll act as a sort of sort of like a filter, or act as a connection to it, and give you some modicum of control, which could be helpful, could make all the difference.
Wonderful. So on that note, let me just, Dean, thank you again for this fantastic talk, and for being so understanding and helpful with all the answers to the questions we've had. And I want to thank our audience also for their questions and interest, and just say that the recording of this event will be available on the festival YouTube channel, which can be accessed from Watch Again section of the festival website after 20th of June. You'll be contacted by email when the video is available to view. If you would like to purchase the book, Dean's book, which is called Psychological, it will be available from our partner booksellers at Fox Lane Books. For more information on the book sales, please see the festival website, or go directly to foxlanebooks.co.uk. We very much hope that you will continue to be engaged in our York Festival of Ideas. We're celebrating our 10th year this year. Please check out the website, which is yorkfestivalofideas.com, for full details of all events in the festival program. We'd love to hear your thoughts on these events and continue the conversations using the hashtag @YorkIdeas, hashtag YorkIdeas. Dean, thank you so very much for taking the time and effort to share your thoughts on this. And that will be all from us. Take care.
Bye.